Tonight we've got a special guest, Brother Geoff Richards, and tonight we're going to be talking to him about addiction. Now, Geoff is a doctor, a physician who specializes in substance abuse and addiction. Is that right, Geoff?
Sure.
Yep, great. And Geoff's going to speak to us from a biblical and professional perspective about what addiction is and some of the steps we can take to prevent and overcome any addictions, especially to nicotine, alcohol, and other drugs. He's going to give us tips on how we can support any of our loved ones who are struggling through these addictions. And even if it's not you that's directly affected, you probably know someone that is. So we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say tonight, Geoff, about addictions and substance abuse and what we can do about it. So welcome and thanks for joining us.
Great, thank you. Thanks.
As a reading tonight, just wanted to read Psalm 18, verses 2 to 6. It says this: "The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. My God is my rock, in whom I take refuge. He is my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. I call to the Lord, who is worthy of praise, and I am saved from my enemies. The cords of death entangled me. The torrents of destruction overwhelmed me. The cords of the grave coiled around me. The snares of death confronted me. In my distress, I cried to the Lord. I cried to my God for help. From his temple, he heard my voice. My cry came before him into his ears." So, yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to start with the first very obvious question. What is addiction?
I thought you might ask then. So addiction is a biopsychosocial disorder characterized by persistent use of substances despite substantial harm and adverse consequences. So,
cool. So can you just say that in ordinary people's words?
Before you all shut your computers down and go and do something else, let's break that down a bit, because I would feel the same way exactly. So when we talk about a biological disorder, that means the physical side of things. Biological, the human body. When we talk about a psychological things, we all know that refers to the mind, and then when we refer to social, that refers to the broader community or individual setting at a social functional level. So we call it a biopsychosocial disorder characterized by persistent use of substances. Now, what does that mean? Persistent use: if someone has exposure to a drug all at once on a Saturday night, that does not mean that they're addicted. So there's a chronicity, or there's a period of time, there's a length of time, a persistence, which is implicit in the definition. In other words, it doesn't happen after one use of drugs. So far we've got a biopsychosocial disorder characterized by persistent use of substances, and then the next part is very important: despite substantial harm and adverse consequences. Now, that may not be critical to the diagnosis, but the feature of that is, supposing I am drinking excessively and my lovely wife says to me, "If you keep on drinking, I'm going to leave you." And I say, "Yes, dear," but then keep on drinking, then there's going to be a significant adverse consequence because of my persistence in drinking. If someone continues to use heroin, despite them causing physical harm to themselves, repeated infections, losing their job, then that's a feature of a drug harm or adverse consequence. So putting it all together, there's a number of factors to a substance addiction relating to the harms, because of the use of that substance with some chronicity.
So does it mean that if somebody's unable to stop despite the harm that's happening to them, that they are unable to? They can't just stop it?
They're unable or unwilling, or both?
Either of those, and that's where it's good to have a definition, but then let's talk about some examples and let's proceed a little bit, and we'll get some thoughts and some discussion happening. For example, it might be both of those scenarios that you put to, unwilling and unable, or it may be that both of those things, as commonly happens, both of those things fluctuate. So on Monday morning, someone might be very willing to stop using substance, but by the time they get to Sunday afternoon, their resolution may be failing to some degree. So let's make a small disclaimer here at this stage. We all know that people talk about a chocolate addiction or a gambling.
Yeah, I was feeding that just a little bit earlier, actually, the chocolate one.
Yes, don't talk to me about my chocolate addiction, please. But that's not something, especially gambling addictions and some of those other social addictions, that's not something that I really want to talk about tonight specifically, even though they share some of those features in that definition that we discussed. They might share some of the features, but I guess my expertise, my interest is in substance, it's the chemical addictions. So I wanted to now, before we go further with the what is addiction, there's a couple of extra key things to mention. And I think if we labour the point a little bit in some of these definitions, some of these basics now, it might actually help us then as we move through some of the difficult scenarios that come up. So we've talked about one complicated definition, which we've dealt with. Two other concepts. One is we talk about drug dependence. So that's another loaded term that means something. And one of the keys associated with drug dependence or a substance dependence is that there's a physical or psychological tolerance which develops. So what that means, let's stick to, for example, alcohol. If I was to have 3 drinks of alcohol, I might be falling asleep and virtually unconscious because I don't have much tolerance, whereas a hardened drinker may be able to drink 13 drinks and not have so much effect. In other words, the body, with the passage of time, gets used to a substance. So that's a physical dependence. A psychological dependence may be such that someone craves to have a substance, and that's a real thing. It's not just an emotion, but it's a psychological dependence. So another way of thinking of it is that it takes an increasing amount of a substance to have the same level of effect. This is going back to basic level. I think I'm only to our audience that we have here. I think everyone knows these concepts, but it's good just to assume nothing and go back to the basics so that we're all talking from the same page. So we've got physical and psychological dependence relating to having tolerance, and then the other thing that happens is what we call a withdrawal syndrome. And for example, if I was heavily dependent on alcohol, then if I stop, then some bad things will happen. And we've heard of people becoming clammy or becoming anxious, becoming irritable, agitated, and physically craving to get a drink. And certainly the same thing happens with other substances like methamphetamine, absolutely, or the opiates like heroin, or any sort of opiate dependence. So the concept of a withdrawal phenomenon happens. So all of those things happen as part of a drug dependence. Now, we've used the word substance. I use the word substance or drug interchangeably. We've talked about the concept of an addiction, And then we talked about the concept of dependence. So where do the two interrelate? So let me give you an example. I saw someone on Wednesday and they had been using a certain drug for a long time, and they've been acquiring it from their doctor. They've been using it to treat their pain, and then they found that they were needing more and more of it. So they told their doctor, can I please have more, because I'm needing a bigger quantity. So that's that tolerance and the desire, and they were starting to really need it, so they were craving for it. So this person became dependent on it.
Right.
However, the next thing that happened over the passage of time is they actually needed to lie. They needed, in their minds, to lie to their doctor. And they said, oh, listen, I lost the script. I'm sorry, I never got it filled. And then the sort of things that we hear are, you won't believe it. I can't believe this happened. It was in my trousers pocket, and it got, the whole packet of medication got washed through the washing cycle. Been right through the laundry, and they're not takeable. And besides, I had some others, the dog got them. Oh, and the script, I don't know what happened to it. I think I might have torn it up. Here's a classic one. You know, I knew I was using too much product. I was using too much of this, so I decided no more. So I actually incinerated. I burnt them and I threw them. I got rid of them. I threw them away. Once you've heard all of these things bit by bit, it's very unlikely that if someone has actually developed a dependence on a drug, that they are actually going to incinerate them or throw them away so they can start afresh. Much more commonly is what's actually happening is they're moving from, what's the term, substantial harm and adverse consequences. They're moving into some addictive behaviours.
Right.
Sounds that way, eh?
Lying to the doctor, but an addictive behaviour might commonly be that they actually needed to steal some money from their parents so that they could then go and acquire some illicit drugs, or they actually started manufacturing drugs. So this is where we talk about crossing the line, and they've gone from clearly doing legal, normal, moral behaviours. It's not illegal to get painkillers from your doctor, but then once you start doing some of those dodgier behaviours, it's pretty obvious that they've crossed the line into some addictive behaviours.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so addictive behaviour tends to look a little bit more underhand then in what they're doing and what they're wanting.
Yeah, instead of dealing with things headlong, they're maladaptive. And if we go, I might have given some extreme examples. What about something a little bit more subtle, like, oh, honey, I know you're concerned about my drinking, but I actually haven't had a drink this week. But the actual truth of the matter is it's actually only been 3 days. So you say I haven't had a drink this week, but it may only have been. So you just, you know, half true, hiding things, little tricks, and of course, so
bending the truth a lot.
Yeah, that's right. And we're not just fooling other people, we're fooling ourselves too sometimes in that sort of situation.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So I want to bamboozle you with all of these basic concepts. This is Drugs 101. This is what I teach the students as they come through. I do a little bit of teaching for junior psychiatrists when they're learning to be psychiatrists, because they need to know about drugs. So I'm going to go through a couple of extra points. Robert and Sharon, you did say we would be taking a Bible-based approach to this. Well, we will get, but I think it's good to have these basic concepts so that we're all talking off the same page. So a couple of comments from what I call Drugs 101, the first lecture on drugs, and that is one of my pet concerns is, and you did a good job, Robert, when you introduced the subject. You referred to tobacco, alcohol, and other drugs. One of my concerns is when people say, Geoff's interested in treating alcohol and drugs. Because you can see what's happening there. There's an implication that alcohol isn't actually a drug. And even though we all know that alcohol is a drug, by breaking it, alcohol and drugs, we're just sort of fooling ourselves. And let's be really, really clear that in terms of the harms of these drugs we're talking about, whatever research you want to quote, whatever country of the world, whatever time period, however you want to look at it, the #1 killer, the taker of human lives from any substance, it's tobacco. 100%, every time, however you look at it. And that, of course, because tobacco is ubiquitous. It's prominently smoked, even though every government is trying to reduce smoking, tobacco consumption. It's still the most commonly used drug, and it has the most common harms. Hot on the heels behind tobacco, in terms of loss of life and physical and social harms, is alcohol.
Right, okay.
So we're talking about substance abuse tonight, including each of those. I'm not going to be focusing that much on tobacco addiction. That's for the public health physicians. Just let's be really clear, we're talking about alcohol and other drugs, which is a good way of just pointing it out. So thank you for that.
Okay.
Drugs 1, point #2, drugs are a universal part of human experience. They're everywhere. And if you go back to the 1920s, if you think of the days in the US of prohibition, or if you think of America's war on drugs, there's still drugs. There's always been drugs, whether it's alcohol or tobacco. For many hundreds of years, there's been drugs. If we were in a remote place, if we were in Tanna, Vanuatu, and no one can afford perhaps some of the other drugs, but you would find in Fiji or in Tanna or in Tonga, you would find kava. Drug use is all about availability. Now, this might sound very, very basic, but it's actually all about availability. What I'm referring to is, I would hate to stereotype, but stereotypes sometimes help. What is a drug that comes out of Scotland, which is so popular that it actually shares the name? It's Scotch.
Scotch. Ah, yes, Scotch. Okay.
Scotch whiskey. Absolutely. In Scotland, we might have Scotch whiskey. If we're in the Pacific Islands, we may have kava. Okay. What about we're in the desert of Australia, rural areas, very socially depressed areas, and I'm 11 years old. I know I can't walk into a bottle shop and access alcohol because they won't sell it to me, but I can go down to the hardware store and I can get some glue. Or I can find someone, I can steal some petrol. And we know that in some socially depressed areas, solvent inhalation is a very, very real problem. So I'm just giving.
I remember seeing that quite clearly when I was young. I remember some kids running around the school, breaking all the windows with their bare hands after they've been sniffing glue. Yeah, it's terrible.
Yeah. Will we find much heroin dependence here in New Zealand? No, because we're the end of the customs line, and New Zealand customs do a pretty good job. And there is not much. There is a little bit, but there's not much heroin here. Whereas if we were in London or anywhere in the US, there's no shortage of heroin. So it's all to do with. It might sound very, very obvious, but can you see the implication then follows on? If a drug isn't available, then there's not going to be a drug problem.
Yeah,
Sad,
that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Don't just say to me, okay, well, that's easy. Let's make sure that there are no drugs. Let's ban cigarettes. Let's ban alcohol. Let's ban because actually, I say New Zealand is a little country at the end of the line, but it's got a very big coastline, and drugs can get smuggled in by ship or by drone or by air or by sea. Whatever, it's It's not quite that simple. But to have that principle that it's all about availability is a good thing. A good thing to remember anyway.
Yep.
So, sorry for too many definitions and basics, but just so we know, I think we have to have an acceptance that drugs are ubiquitous. Not picking on the Scottish for their Scotch whisky or the Ireland, but there are different drugs available, and certainly different drugs available here in New Zealand. Does that make sense?
Even Noah had a vineyard and got drunk from it, so you know that was right back then.
Yeah, that's true. That's exactly true. So does that make sense as far as those basic things?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep, definitely. Yeah. No, thanks for that.
Yeah, great. Did you want to fire away with any other question, or shall we?
Well, is there something we can do to prevent ourselves? Like, you know, we might not be addicted yet, or well, yes. Let's say we might not be addicted. Is there anything we can do to prevent ourselves from addiction? You know, is it an easy thing to get into, and then you know, and what can we do to prevent that?
Yeah, well, let's just have a think about how a drug problem may look. So you can tell the way I'm talking. I've already talked about injecting drug use, like heroin and methamphetamine, the sorts of drugs that would put people in prison. But let's just go a little bit more subtle than that, and just say, well, how could it actually look amongst our neighbours, our brothers and sisters, our own families? What are the sort of things you're saying? How can it be prevented? Well, how could it actually be identified? So once again, let's go back to our definition, and let's think about some of the harms associated with it. And when I say these things, you'll say, of course, that would be a very obvious thing, but it's just good to know, just to put it out there. So if you go and see one of your work colleagues on Monday, and all of a sudden you notice their arm is up, their arm's in a cast, and they say, oh, I fell over, broke my wrist on Saturday night.
Yep.
Okay, so I don't need to go on further. There could be, it might have been falling down the steps at an absolutely dry event, but someone may have had some excess alcohol, been completely drunk and fallen down. And sometimes that becomes very clear as things come out. That could be the sort of sign. The other thing, when I'm talking to people, if I'm just, you know, exploring some issues, one of the things I routinely ask about is, and do you have a driver's license? Oh, no. Oh, no, you don't. You don't drive? No, I lost my license. That's an absolute dead giveaway. And you might say, but I don't even know anyone who has ever lost their license because of excessive drinking, because of a drunk driving charge. But out there in the community, it's a very common reason why people may not be driving. Something that is so subtle, sometimes it may not cross our minds, and that is effect on relationships. You know, we may know how, and we're not just talking about alcohol, particularly cannabis. You know, people who may not have any particular problems, but may be having huge troubles, a huge strain on their relationships relating to that. Another thing to look out for, this is this almost falls into the drug 101 student level, but a good concept to have. Just remember this this term. Someone who is getting involved with a substance which is leading to problems will demonstrate a narrowing of repertoire of activity, or a narrowing of repertoire of behaviour. So if you get out your guitar, Robert, you've got a huge repertoire. You can do not just the Praise the Lord book. You know, you could play some hymns, and you can play some rockabilly, I'm sure, and you can get out and play all sorts of things. You've got a huge repertoire.
Yeah, don't talk me up like that, though, Geoff, you know. Someone will prove you wrong.
Repertoire likewise, you know. I'm going kayaking, or going for a walk in the Hanuas, or you might be going to an ecclesial camp, or you might be doing some mending jobs around the house. You and Sharon may be going for a drive. You may have some, the list goes on and on, what sort of things you could be doing. Sometimes it can be a bit subtle, but clear. The sort of person who may have some alcohol problem, they may find that more and more of their activities relate to alcohol. Oh, we're just going for a few drinks. Oh, we're going to a restaurant tonight.
Yeah,
oh,
place.
At the workplace, whatever. At home, what are you doing? I'm just watching the game. So, you know, each of those things, alcohol. Now, I'm not picking on alcohol. Let's pick on another example. Let's take a 13-year-old. You may notice in the 13-year-old that more of their friends are actually of like mind in smoking cannabis. So they have a narrowing repertoire of relationships because they've got like-minded friends. Okay, so narrowing of repertoire is just a good thing to be aware of in terms of things. So we've had the easy part of the talk. Now we're moving on to the hard part: how to prevent, how to treat, what to do about it, how to fix yourself, how to fix other people. So I wish I had now too, because it really is very, very difficult. I guess what I would guide people to do is to keep it very simple and keep to the basics. And remember, we're dealing with long-standing things with our family, friends, brothers and sisters, and certainly the starting point, of course, love, prayer, the scriptures. In terms of prevention, and we must give a little bit of special attention to youth. This is not a subject that only relates to young people. Drugs, substances, it's not only that, but we do tend to think of young people because young people have got less frontal lobe development, that bit at the front of their brain that involves planning, socialization, thinking ahead. Young people haven't got much frontal lobe. That comes later. And the research over the last years is indicating we're not talking about, you know, we think of, you know, turning 18, you can drive a car, turning 21, you have a 21st birthday, you're an adult, you can drink liquor, you can vote, you know, what happened. But we're talking about frontal lobe development going on well into the 25-year-old age group, and so forth. So when we're expecting, you know, if you're as a disgruntled parent saying to your 14-year-old, come on, act your age, well, I'm sorry to say that they are acting their age exactly. And what do young people want to do? They want to jump off the 25-metre cliff. They want to drive cars too fast with too many people on board. They want to do insane things on a skateboard, and they want to take risks with their friends. Their peer group is very important, and they want to take their risk using drugs. So that's almost ubiquitous. So I guess that comes back to something that's pretty obvious from prevention, and that is when Deborah and I had our two lovely boys, aged 3, we thought, well, let's better start the drug prevention strategy now that they're 3 years old.
Yep.
We picked their schooling so that they would be having their music lessons and their sports training and their socialisation such that they were being kept busy.
I see. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's really important. Yeah.
And I found, you know, so easy. It's hard to keep kids busy in this day and age, and profitably busy. And, you know, do we try and direct their friends? Of course we do. Do we try and direct their busyness? Not saying that any of this is easy, but it's just when we're talking about young people and we're talking about how they are going to reach a stage when they want to be jumping off the 25-metre cliff, you know, minor offences or experimenting with drugs or giving a fake name to their school teacher, all of those things, that's normal development. But we can have them, you know, doing their rugby and their tennis and their various things, as well as the activities with the whānau, family activities and ecclesial activities, all of that builds up to it.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So what happens when your 14-year-old does start to, you know, hang out with the wrong crowd, or you know, you notice that the alcohol was missing from the cabinet, or, you know, something like that? What's happening there? What would your advice be?
Related to all of those things, there is another magic word which comes into play, and there is a leading alcohol specialist, actually, ironically from Scotland. He's a Scottish specialist who has travelled the world, and you could actually summarise his mission with one word. Might sound like an oversimplification, and that is connectedness.
Mm-hmm.
Connectedness. And he sees addiction as being the opposite of connectedness. And if we see someone who has a substance problem, then we go back and we say, well, let's look for a disconnect and see if there is any disconnect. Now, obviously, if we acknowledge that substance abuse is not picked on or unique to upper class, lower class, any particular socio-economic group, but let's just be very clear that you can have a disconnect through your school years, through your relating to your family, relating to interactions. It's just something to be aware of.
One of the things, one of the things that I remember from my my Drug Proof Your Kids days was is that kids that eat meals together with their families, I think it was something like 5 days a week, are far less likely, and I think it was something like 75% less likely to get hooked on drugs or alcohol than their peers. And
yeah, and
you're probably just about to say that, actually, Geoff.
That may seem oversimplification, but that's the point, isn't it? You know, just to have this awareness, and families work differently, but across every level of family life, we're looking for opportunities for prevention. Now, let's fast forward now. We're not talking about children anymore. We're talking about your brother-in-law, not your brother-in-law, but we're talking about your brother-in-law or someone, and you perceive that they're maybe they're smoking weed, and you think it's problematic, it's not good for their health, something. So it would be naive to say, listen, I think you're depressed. You're clearly smoking weed to get a little bit of comfort, to help with your anxiety or your depression or your insomnia. Let's quote Psalm 18. Let's look at the example of take my burden upon you. Let's think of comfort ye, comfort ye. Now, I'm being a little bit facetious here. I think you may detect. I'm not saying that any of those scriptures aren't helpful, of course, but we're talking now about someone who has got a significant addictive, maladaptive drug problem. And I just picked for variety on cannabis. It could be alcohol, or it could be an opiate drug problem. So I'm not saying there's something wrong with quoting scripture, but it's all to do with someone's readiness, someone's appropriateness for taking on board something. Now, I guess I'm speaking from the experience that I speak to people who may drink one bottle of spirits before 5 p.m. So they're drinking 33 standard drinks before their evening starts, and then they'll drink on that. So some of those people are in no fit state to, if that was your brother-in-law, to be, or sister-in-law, or family friends, to be hearing about scripture. However, I think we can all have an assessment in our mind about timing and about appropriateness, and because we have a knowledge of the individual, about when is the moment. And that's why I particularly like that little cameo from the proverb, a word fitly spoken. It's an apple of gold in a setting of silver. So who knows what the setting is, but there might be just that apple of gold, a word in season that can come into it.
Yeah.
Now, we've already jumped into a scriptural thing, but let's just go back one step, just as a reminder. If you had a family member, let's don't have a panic, but let's pick, for example, someone like David Luxmore. If he was having a significant heart problem, would you really sit him down in your lounge room and try and help? You would get a medical specialist, preferably a cardiologist, real quick and try and get onto the problem. If someone has cancer, you want them to get their medical help. So let's just remember, we are dealing with one model of drug dependence, is that it's a chronic medical disorder. I haven't really emphasized that, but sure, it's a social disorder, but remember, it's a biopsychosocial disorder. So let's just go back a step and say, yes, we can get those apples of gold happening, but let's just remember, are they getting, are they ready for, do you know how to get them some help?
So who should we go to?
That's a tough one.
Do we take them to the GP or bring a helpline, or?
All of the above. Let's face it, in New Zealand, we are enrolled with a family doctor, so GPs are trained and they're usually in our own suburb or not too far away. It's usually only a day or 3 and you can get in to see someone. People forget that they can actually take their family member to the doctor. They don't have to send them, so there can be some negotiation. So of course that GPs, if are trained, if they don't feel comfortable or they don't have the skills to deal with something, to actually have a pretty good referral network to do so. I think even 10 years ago, your local family doctor was less equipped than they are now. So I'm putting in a plug to say, yes, of course. But when I say all of the above, New Zealand has some very good websites, and it's not rocket science. You know, if us oldies, Robert, Sharon, you, me, that sort of thing, us oldies can't find something, get an 8-year-old. They can always fix your computer better than we can.
Yeah, that's right.
So, you know, it's usually not hard to get some direction. And in this nation, we're very blessed to have free, specific, specialised help. So I guess let's just leave that as a black box, either via GP or via some specialised services, that there is help out there medically. But I really want to...
Yeah, maybe in the email I send next time, maybe we could get together and send some information, some websites to have a look at.
Absolutely, yeah, as a starting point. Sure.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great. Yeah.
So as I say, I was being a little bit facetious, saying, you know, it's not always appropriate just to quote scripture, well, but just to quote scripture. Our scripture is our tool. It's how we apply it and where things are at. Remembering an individual can have significant denial.
Yeah. Okay, so
just saying, I'm going to
sort of move on.
Yeah.
How can we, if I find I'm addicted, if I, you know, like been listening to you tonight, and which I well, I was going to say which I haven't been drinking, but but I have been listening. But assuming I had been drinking, you know, and I've been like just, you know, gradually my alcohol levels are increasing and increasing, and what do I need to do now? You know, I've just suddenly realised listening to you that I'm addicted to wine. What do I do?
Very, very difficult, because there will always be an element of self-denial or an element of denial. And I will go back a couple of paragraphs and say it's actually the same process as if you wanted to help someone else, and that is in terms of seeking help from a professional, but also seeking help from our brothers and sisters in terms of support, or a good friend, or a trusted friend. I guess probably at this point it's worth mentioning that when I'm treating someone and they have had multiple visits to hospital, they may have been incarcerated, they may have lost everything, they may be homeless. By the time they come to me, the jig is up. It's very clear what they're here for, and we're aware where things stand. They have got a problem. Now, for you, Brother Robert, with your fictitious alcohol problem, you notice I got that word in, fictitious.
Yeah, well, thank you.
For you, of course, you're not at that level where the jig is up, where things are so far down. So we're talking about those subtleties. So, you know, on Monday and Tuesday, you may have a resolution. I'm going to talk to someone about this. But by Wednesday, Thursday, that resolution may fluctuate quite a lot. So that's where it's very difficult. And I have to say, individualised care, individualised according to the situation and what the personal need would be is where it comes into it. So, but going back to the basics of seeking help from a confidential professional source and seeking help from someone else. But since you talked about alcohol, that is a different situation from the illicit drugs. And I may as well just put it out there that if you were coming to me today, sometimes just not everyone needs to be psychoanalyzed. Not everyone, we don't need to look for a disconnect. You know, we don't need to be Sigmund Freud, lie you on the couch and say, you know, is there a problem with your mother? So my wife will be watching this and she'll say, Geoff, you're wrong. You do need to have that discussion. He might be very cross at me for saying this, but let's just, in the very simple principle, there are some pragmatic, practical things that can make a big difference. And I'm sorry for being so basic, but it needs to be said. Supposing, Robert, with your problem, which is fictitious, and it's now 6 p.m. and you've had a pretty hard day at work and you're actually quite thirsty and you just want a beer, okay? Yep. So let's start with the practicalities. For a start, if you buy your beers by the 24, by the slab, by the 24, and you have got a couple of slabs in the back room and half of them are in the fridge, then already we're off to a bad start because we know you've got that availability. We talked about availability.
Yeah.
In addition to that, if you haven't got any soda water, most people have a tap, but sometimes people for some reason like chilled chilled beverage, so to have some tap water in the fridge, or a bottle of soda water, or some sugar-free beverage that they like, so that they can space. The concept is spacing their drinks. To have some non-drinking activities. Let's just be very pragmatic. I had a patient who he attributed his success in giving up alcohol, and he had a big problem. He attributed his success to taking a different route home from work in the car, because his car almost automatically pulled into the bottle store, which he drove by 5 nights a week, plus a couple of extra trips on the weekend. And when he changed his route and made sure he was on more motorway or different roads, he found that was helpful. So I'm just saying that, you know, they're the sorts of almost stupidly simple principles. Alternate drinks. Don't start drinking at 4 p.m. You know, try and delay, try and get some sporting activity in first, do some other activity. Your self-help websites and the little brochures will usually have, you know, 20 bullet points, and it's a good thing. Put a circle around, you know, your top 3 bullet points. Hey, I've never thought of that. That's a good idea. Bingo. So for your fictitious problem, Robert, we may be able to just do some very simple techniques, which at least get you off to a good start.
Cool.
Yeah, yeah, sounds good.
To pause and look at the clock. Yes, you can tell I get about this subject, can't you? Time goes.
Yeah. So last question then. Can addictions be broken? If we've got an addiction, can it be broken? Can we overcome it? I assuming we can from what you've been saying. But
100%, and of course, a common consideration is, a drug addict, someone who's using problem, and they often think about the more serious drug uses, intravenous drug use, methamphetamine, heroin. They think of the more serious things, and they'll say, oh, they can only get out of this cycle if they want to. Well, of course, that's the case. You know, we can only eat a balanced diet if we want to. No one can make us do anything we don't want to. But I would be very positive and say, whether it's one of the greatest harmed illicit drugs or one of the socially ubiquitous drugs, I would be very positive and say, in the right setting at the right time, when an individual has the readiness for it, with the right support and the right approach. And don't forget, in our brotherhood, we have an environment of support. We don't have within our fellowship a large number of people who are bank robbers. So therefore, we don't deal with people who are grappling with having come out of jail, okay? And in the same way, we have a large amount of buffering from some of the social troubles in this world, which is one of our blessings. Of course, I picked on alcohol for obvious reasons, that it's something that is very common, but everything applies. We can be very, very positive indeed. I'll just get one word in before I let you open your mouth again, Robert, and ask another question. This is just a very important medical thing. Sometimes people will be concerned, oh, if we stop someone using cannabis suddenly, then something terrible will happen because they'll be going cold turkey. Or if we stop someone, if we get someone off heroin, we know they'll turn into a monster, and we have to stop. So one thing I always teach the young medical students, there are only, for intents and purposes, there are only 2 drugs that if you stop suddenly, like you go from 100% problematic use to 0, that are so harmful that someone may actually die.
Okay.
And the 2 drugs are alcohol, because you've heard of somebody if having a large amount of alcohol and their brain is used to that level of alcohol, and then they can have a withdrawal seizure. In other words, they can have an epileptic type of fit. Their body isn't used to having seizures, so it's an unusual thing for them. They have a seizure and they die. So that's, and other bad things can happen as well. They can have an acute alcohol withdrawal syndrome, which can be fatal. The other drug is a similar drug in that it's also a neurological depressant, and that is the benzodiazepine family of pills, and that includes Valium or many other medications that end in PAM. So diazepam, oxazepam, clonazepam, anything that ends in PAM, they're all the sedative, muscle relaxing, and not all, but some types of sleeping tablets. If they're withdrawn from the brain suddenly, the same thing can happen with alcohol. So the implication is if someone suddenly reduces cannabis or reduces their even their heroin use, it'll be very unpleasant for them, but they won't die. And that's very important for doctors to know that, you know, if someone comes in and says, you better get me these drugs, doc, otherwise something terrible will happen. No, it won't. It won't be terrible. It'll be unpleasant for you, but it's not that. It's certainly not fatal, apart from those two I mentioned. That's a bit of medicine, but I just thought.
So the ones that could be fatal, how are they dealt with? They would have to be dealt with a gradual decreasing of the substance.
Exactly right.
Yeah. And that will be okay for the brain to do it that way. That the brain will manage that and readjust to the new levels. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Oh, thank you very much, Geoff. We are out of time. We really appreciate all you've said tonight. It's been great. It's been a real education, and I'm sure there's going to be either people listening tonight or people who are going to be listening on the recording who are going to go, yeah, this is just what I needed to hear. So we really appreciate what you've done.
Well, what I'd like to do is take a potentially damaging, depressing, extremely difficult subject, but present it with a positivity that we don't often get through the media. And, you know, we are all blessed with a huge amount of brain power, problem solving, and when we can take the emotional components out of it for ourselves, we're in a good position where we can actually really help people. So thank you for that.
Thank you.